It's a real pleasure to be with all of you here in this room today because we all have such a common and shared agenda to make the world a better place through business. And that is something that is needed and that I'm grateful for. So it's a real pleasure to be here today. It's also a pleasure to be here because Mars, as Aaron spoke to the other day, shares the belief that this is a decisive decade, that we need a more inclusive form of capitalism, and that we need to remake what we are doing and how we do it. I also stand here as someone whose favorite place to be is nature. I love conference rooms, but especially, again, ones filled with an audience like this, but nature is my favorite place to be. And yet nature doesn't have a voice, but my son's despair does. He doesn't have a sense that all will be okay, as I did when I was his age, running around the creeks and woods of New Hampshire and Maryland. He doesn't have a sense that all is going to be right or is right in the world. For me, I eventually ran into the reality that all was not right, and that led me to pursue organic farming, and beyond that, to join Mars, as I came to see that business, and in fact big business, needed to be and could be a real part of the solution to the world's issues. For my son, the realization that all was not right came far earlier, with the science that says the world isn't on a trajectory towards a viable future, and that we have roughly 10 years to address the critical issues. With this as a backdrop, his generation are taking on the burden of trying to do something about these global issues, the global issues that we face, at a far younger age. And that's, of course, why we're here today, to talk about a new climate for business. I might modify that to a new and necessary climate for business. As chairman of a family-owned business and a father, it's clear to me that the time for this shift is now. In both these roles, I want a sustainable and mutually beneficial future full of opportunities for children and adults the world over, and for the business my great-grandfather started in his kitchen over 100 years ago. At Mars, it's become clear to us that we have to dramatically shift the trajectory we're on to enable such a future. And time isn't on our side, I think, as all of us in this room know. We have to lean in to drive progress on the critical issues, from climate change to water stress, from biodiversity loss to human rights, from gender inequality to addressing poverty in global agricultural supply chains. And yet just last week, as we know, the Trump administration disappointingly submitted the paperwork to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. So those of us who care about the climate crisis, as we all do, unfortunately are just going to have to work harder and step up even more than we are. Soon, my son's generation will run the world. They'll hold the positions of power, control consumer spending, and vote their values. But right now, we're in charge, those of us in this room and beyond. And the next generation is holding us to account, including Greta Thunberg's plea that I take very seriously. And as she said, adults keep saying we owe it to the young people to give them hope. But I don't want your hope, I want you to panic. She's right. Hope isn't a strategy, but nor is panic. What we need is action, again, as we all in this room know and are committed to. Over the course of this next decade, we as leaders have to create a future where all people can thrive without further endangering the remarkable biodiversity of the planet that supports our very existence. And we can't let gridlock and inaction define the next 10 years. For those who think there's any other option than action, I believe they're either limited in their vision, their compassion, or in their understanding of how the actions needed are actually in their own self-interest. By no means do we have all the answers at Mars. In fact, we face serious and systemic challenges in the global agricultural supply chains that we and the whole consumer packaged goods industry rely upon. but we are fundamentally changing how we do business and working with others to try and catalyze seismic changes and systemic changes in our industry. Seismic, I guess, would be Rio Tinto. I'm looking for systemic, but seismic wouldn't be bad either. What does that look like? What would that look like, that kind of change? Well, for starters, business needs to set science-based targets to guide our strategies, because the science leads us to transformational, not incremental change. And what we need is transformation at scale. At Mars, this has led us to craft our Sustainable in a Generation plan and to invest $1 billion just as a start. This plan includes doing our part to nurture a healthy planet, improve the lives of 1 million people in our supply chain, and help consumers and their pets live healthier lives. And it has some ambitious goals, including a science-based target to slash our greenhouse gas emissions across our entire value chain by 2/3, which is to say, we're looking at our impact beyond our operational footprint. That truly is a challenge, but it's what the data and the science tells us is required for us to do our part, to take ownership of the whole footprint of our business, as must all businesses. And that starts with putting our own house in order by reaching net zero emissions in our operations. And our path to that is by shifting to renewable electricity. Already, 53% is from renewable sources. And with that, we're seeing both savings and cost avoidance. So the business case for making this change is real, and the environmental benefits are unquestionable. In fact, we feel we've cracked the code on how to do this, and there's no reason any business of scale can't employ the same. And we're happy to share how we did it with anyone, anytime. So there's a clear opportunity for business to accelerate the move to renewables, and an onus on all stakeholders to demand this shift through public policy. The larger and more difficult task is to fix what's broken in the extended agricultural supply chains that we rely upon. What makes this so difficult is that it's outside of our direct control and part of a complex, shared political, social, and environmental ecosystem that is the lifeblood of millions of smallholder farms and all businesses that rely on agricultural crops. Therefore, the only way to make meaningful progress is through collaboration with others and using our influence to drive action. Again, something that all of us in this room know and subscribe to, and BSR is a leader in helping us to achieve. For example, deforestation is one of the main drivers of emissions from agriculture, and there has been little to no progress in stopping it. And that's absolutely just not acceptable. So, we clearly need to do something different. And for us at Mars, that means reinventing the way we manage our supply chains. For starters, we've aligned our procurement and sustainability strategies and functions. As a result, two functions which traditionally may have been at odds with one another are now united with a shared vision of what success looks like. Now, when we buy ingredients, we consider price and quality alongside and equal to the cost to society and to the environment. Secondly, we're working to simplify our supply chains. By eliminating complexity, we can better monitor, engage, educate, and mitigate as needed, in partnership with suppliers, NGOs, and governments. Our ambitions in palm oil are a good example of all this brought to life. The supply chain for palm oil isn't working. It's doing significant harm, and it can't be sustained in its current form. Again, something that all of us in this room would know. As a buyer, we have the responsibility to drive social and environmental change through our own choices and practices. So, our Palm Positive plan aims to deliver 100% deforestation-free palm oil by the end of 2020 and advance respect for human rights. We believe that simplification and verification are a critical means to achieve this. I share that because even though we're a small user of palm oil, that supply comes from over 1,500 mills, and by the end of 2020, we'll have reduced that to fewer than 100. We're also setting new expectations for suppliers, letting them know that we expect them to commit to supplying all their customers with sustainable palm oil, not just what they provide to Mars. And the suppliers who step up are going to be our long-term partners. Our ambitions in palm oil are just one example of how we hope to drive and achieve the systemic change needed to support the planet and its biodiversity, farmers and other workers, and economies where a crop like palm oil is sourced for generations to come. In addition to taking accountability for our own business and working with peers and suppliers in the extended supply chain, we're also calling for action from governments. One example is our position on carbon pricing. It's increasingly clear that a cost attached to carbon is essential to move farther faster, spurring innovation, incentivizing those that are lagging, and leveling the competitive playing field for early adopters. We need governments to do their part to put equitable and effective policies in place so that companies, not our children, are bearing the cost of their emissions. But there's a broader call to action as well. If we want governments to move, we, as companies, have to advocate on the issues impacting society on our planet and to do so collectively. For example, Mars is working with Ceres Bicep Group alongside dozens of other companies on advocacy around carbon pricing and climate action at the state and federal level to press U.S. policymakers toward immediate action. Joint advocacy is an important way for business to make a difference on these critically important issues and a tool available to all, regardless of sector. As leaders and influencers, we have a moral obligation to be the voice of the planet and the world's children. All businesses need to be taking action within their own operations and beyond, reinventing how we do things and working to be part of the solution based on what the science tells us is necessary. We have to come together as industry peers to create new standards that create value for the bottom line, society, and the environment. And we have to demand decisive and urgent action from our political leaders. 10 years is not a long time to make the changes needed. At Mars, we believe that the world we want tomorrow starts with how we do business today. This next decade will define us as a generation of leaders, and it will decide the future of generations to come. So we're committed, I'm committed, to securing a sustainable future and to working with all of you in this room. Thank you. Hi.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for your commitment and your enthusiasm and the examples that you set. I am pretty surprised because it's not every day that the chairman of a major American brand is so passionate about sustainability. And I'd like to go back to the beginning. So before you joined Mars, you spent over 10 years at Seeds of Change, which is an organic farming and seeds company. Where did this come from? What was your aha moment? You said you grew up sort of in the woods and so on, but what was it?
Right. No, it wasn't with the dirt floor and what have you. But I did grow up with the great fortune of being able to run around, some beautiful landscapes. And I think as I got older, I always had nature as a touch point and always, came back to it and saw it as a and still do as a place of renewal. And certainly as I've gotten older and as is so well known now today, the fragile and complex ecosystems that make up the natural world are just extraordinary and elegant and clearly under threat by what we are doing, as a human population on the planet. And so I think that the realization that we are overstepping our bounds is something that came to me as a young adult, and that's what led me to Seeds of Change, in the sense that I found a business which was actually trying to advocate for, and through its business, address the loss of diversity in farmers and gardeners' crops that they rely upon. And that really gave me the insight that business could be a force for good and part of the solution, as opposed to otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And maybe an additional question there, because we get the question frequently from our members. On the sustainability team, everyone is convinced, but how do we convince at the level of the CEO, the board of directors, when there's just so many priorities to juggle? How do you're convinced, but what's your advice to people who have to convince at your level?
Well, I think the thing to start with is the science of what's transpiring in the world. And when one looks at it, it's very clear that to not take action in the ways that your business is going to be impacted by the number of threats that are facing us, which it's not just science, it's also data. There's the science of climate, there's the data of human rights issues and so forth. But when one looks at it, to think that you could sustain your business into the future, whether you're seeking to simply benefit shareholders or take a more inclusive view, is short-sighted. And so I think that's the place to start. I think also I would suggest that a winning argument is that the talent of today and tomorrow is truly more interested in acting upon that interest more than ever, in terms of wanting to be with a company that is taking a role in addressing the issues that are relevant to their business and how it's impacting the world in the broadest sense.
The theme of the next generations is something that comes up frequently. Your great-grandfather founded Mars in 1911, and that responsibility that you feel towards your son to next generations really comes through. Do you think that it's easier for you to take action on sustainability, or to have a in the debate? Is that easier because you're a private company, a family-held company?
I would say to a large degree, no, because resources are finite in any business, and there's always, more needs than there are resources to go around, as it were. So I think that being said, again, when you are privately held, we perhaps have a capacity to take a longer-term view, and I think we do. And that longer-term view, part of that is looking at the state of the world, and again, coming back to the science and the data being a touch point. When we look at the data and we look at the science and we look at our own operations, we can match up the fact that smallholder farmers are actually seeing decreased yields due to climate stress, climate heat, and due to water shortages, and that's impacting our business, and that's very, very much a direct corollary to the science, sort of writ large. So I think that perhaps we have a head start on others, but I think it is not inherently easier as a privately held company to make the decisions, but it's in all our interest to make those decisions, and I think it's short-sighted to think otherwise.
And so that's something that you've really worked on at the company in terms of integrating the sustainability agenda to the business agenda. So you've taken actions such as the chief procurement officer is also the chief sustainability officer. You also have a new model in the company, which is called the economics of mutuality. And that new model seeks to spread value among various stakeholders. Tell us a little bit about the economics of mutuality and how do you use it at Mars? Right.
Well, mutuality is one of our 5 principles that we have operated our business by really since its inception, though they were only codified in the 70s. And mutuality is one of those, and it's a principle that states that we want all people who we touch with our business to have a mutual benefit. I think over time that's the scope of what is mutual has grown, again with awareness, and now includes the smallholder farmer in West Africa growing cocoa. The question, though, was how do you define mutuality? What does it really look like? You can qualitatively talk about it, but what does it quantitatively look like? And that was a question that we found that we couldn't answer in any real sense unto ourselves. So we found a real partner in Oxford Said Business School who very much subscribed to the notion of the business needing to do more than be about profit, and found in them a partnership, now a 5-year partnership, where we've embarked upon actually quantitatively defining mutuality and using Mars around the world with a number of case studies to look at how do you actually bring that to life. So we're not only putting that into practice in communities, say, in Nigeria, in the slums of Nigeria, as to how do we have a win-win for individuals who historically wouldn't have had an economic, path up, so to speak, with the need to actually get our products distributed into a part of the world that we historically wouldn't have touched. And how do we do that in a mutually beneficial way, so that we're improving their human capital, their financial capital as well. And ultimately, in a broader sense, it has an environmental aspect as well. But that one example is probably best suited to speak to the human and financial capital.
Okay, good. Thank you. Stephen, maybe switching gears a little bit, you highlighted the importance of collaboration. So important, and you guys are such a good example of a company who looks to collaboration to help drive transformative change. What do you see as the benefits of collaboration, and can you tell us, what is your advice, and how do you handle some of the tricks of the trade, collaboration fatigue, lots of new initiatives? How do you decide where to put your energy and resource?
Well, I'm sure you at BSR could teach a master's class on that. But what I would say, from our perspective is collaboration is, I think, the only path forward given the magnitude of the issues that we're facing. But the key is not in finding the collaborator. It's in actually defining the actions that you're going to take together and move forward. And I think that as long as you stay focused on collaboration itself not being the win, but the deliverables being the win, so to speak, then I think there's every reason to think that that's the right path forward. And there's so many examples, including for us being a signator of the We're All In, we're still in, a pledge around climate, which fundamentally came as a result of the Trump administration's posture. And that's a coalition of U.S. businesses and subnational governments actually coming together to state to the administration that we don't agree with your policy. We are still going to press forward with our plans. And it's a point of advocacy and a place to come together for us all to actually seek to drive the change needed. So again, there's so many, countless examples, but that's what I'd share.
And I think you talked about the difficulties of the Trump administration. Tell us a little bit more. Obviously you have operations all over the world, and so you're dealing with difficult situations with governments all over the world. In your role, what do you expect of governments, and how do you collaborate in situations where that collaboration is very difficult, like deforestation?
Well, a couple questions there. So if I lose the thread, bring me back, if you would, to the deforestation point. But I think the United Nations Global Compact actually just recently did a survey that we participated in, where 63% of all CEOs said that political uncertainty was their biggest concern. And what's more sort of interesting, I think, particularly for this audience, is that 42% of those CEOs said that uncertainty was preventing them from making the investments they wanted to make and needed to make in sustainability. So for sure, business has a role to do, I think, what it needs to do for its business interests and for this broader sustainability agenda, which, as referenced earlier, is a business agenda now. I don't think there's a separation between the two. That's certainly how we see it, that they are one and the same. And we need to bring to bear the resources, the tools, the innovation that we can to address the issues. But we simply can't do it without governments. And governments need to be held accountable and with the expectation that it's in their best interest to have a business climate which is clear and forthright and is something that we can count on in terms of its consistency. And so I think there's a dual role between the two, but at the end of the day, we absolutely do need governments to play the role that they do. And when it comes to deforestation, that means enforcing the laws that are actually on the books in a place like the Ivory Coast and Ghana, with all of its complexities. Nonetheless, the government does need to step up and do its part, or else we will never get the results that we're seeking, which they themselves are seeking as well.
You've talked about, some of the actions that you're taking on deforestation, changing your sourcing practices, really sort of focusing your suppliers and looking for the ones who have the practices that you can actually work with. But maybe just on the deforestation topic, what is your read of why we've had so little progress? And as a company with your commitments as well on climate change, on livelihoods, how do you think about the tensions between livelihoods and biodiversity and deforestation on that very complex issue?
Yeah, no, it's incredibly complex indeed. And I have any number of Martians in the audience who could speak to the complexities with far greater knowledge than I. But I have been on the ground in origin any number of times, and it's very clear when you get there that it's an incredibly complex interweave of issues that are leading to deforestation. It's not simply the result of somebody going out and chopping down a tree. It's woven deeply into the fabric of poverty, and endemic poverty being, I think, the core issue. So how do you break that, I think, is the fundamental question around deforestation. Any smallholder farmer, a cocoa farmer, I mean, it's an effort to go go clear a patch of forest. It's an effort to burn it. It's an effort to plant it. It's an effort that I think that farmer would probably rather not do or take, but doesn't have a choice given the situation that he's faced, which is surviving, crop to crop, if not day to day, and not being able to generate enough yield to support his family in terms of the crop that he may be growing, which in this case is cocoa. So what we've tried to do is to look at how do we help that farmer get their nose, not only just above water, but actually sort of drain, the threat, as it were, such that she could take a longer term view. Now, when we've actually dug into it, we've realized that there's very little out there to serve as a guidepost for how to do this. So what we've done is we established and founded the Farmer Income Lab with Oxfam and with other partners like Danone. And the first thing that we did with that entity was to do a significant and massive literature search to see was there anything out there published which could be a guidepost for how to address this issue of poverty in the smallholder farmer community. The reality is that you could count the case studies that have succeeded on one hand. At least in terms of what's published, you could literally count the case studies on one hand that have succeeded. So what we are doing with this is to try to make it a think, do tank, so to speak. So putting into practice at a small scale, at a pilot level, interventions to try to see if we can actually move the needle. And to date, I'm happy and proud to say that we are actually having some real success with vanilla in Madagascar. And some of the components that go into actually that success are first and foremost stepping up as ourselves and putting on the table long-term contracts. So now a farmer all of a sudden knows he or she has a contract which isn't year to year, has a price floor, and can literally kind of take a deep breath to then take advantage of the agronomic training and programs that we're trying to actually impart, which includes also women's empowerment being a key component of that, which of course, as we know, empowered women, certainly in the communities in which I'm talking about, lead to increased yields and increased incomes and increased investments in their businesses and in this case in their farms. And then I think another piece is that we're going to have to face into is that smallholder farmers, just like any business, there are some, or any situation, there are some that are better than others. The reality is that there's generally often not a capacity or a mechanism for the better farmer to either partner with or ultimately even purchase the land from those farmers that aren't as committed, aren't as productive, aren't as capable in order to actually lift all boats, so to speak. So those are some of the interventions that we're finding to be successful and we'll be looking to scale as possible.
Thank you. Super interesting for our audience. And I think the audience may have other questions, so get ready because it's going to be your turn. Well, actually, I think if we have a question now, I'll go ahead and take it, actually. Lots of questions. Okay, we'll start taking questions now. Oh, and a ton of questions on Twitter as well.
Great. Thank you. I'm Aaron Koch from Sempra Energy. And thank you for your discussion of deforestation. The Washington Post, just before Halloween, published a story, which I'm sure you're familiar with, called The Trouble with Chocolate, which talks about Mars's, in 2009, you set a goal to have 100% sustainable cocoa. And at BSR this week, we've talked a lot about, BSR has encouraged us set bold goals. And so my question is, kind of what's your experience been? What have you learned from setting that goal, which, by all accounts, you have yet to meet? Thank you.
No, thank you for the question. I think the one lesson, as you point out in your last comment there, is that the learning is we didn't succeed. In spite of the ambition, in spite of the resources, in spite of the money, in spite of all of our efforts in a collaborative manner, we did not succeed fundamentally. And what that's led us to do is to step back and not give up, but actually to double down. So we've actually just I think it's long ago now, announced now, but we're fully committed to putting another $1 billion on the table for cocoa. We've moved from simply saying certification will get us to where we need to on the issue of particularly the issue of human rights abuses, whether that be forced labor or child labor. We need to employ what we're now calling responsible cocoa, responsible sourcing rather. And that includes, particularly on the labor issue, a process which we did not have previously, which with certification agencies, which we're not walking away from, but in addition to what certification agencies can do, that we actually have our own system for ensuring and verifying what's transpiring on the ground, and then our own system that we're overseeing in part in collaboration again to put in place remediation immediately when when issues are discovered. So I think it's a great question, and it's something that we take very seriously. We're committed to our chocolate business. We're committed to the origins. We're committed to fixing the issues. I don't think they're going to be solved, overnight. But by 2025, we're committed to the fact that our goal is that 100% of our cocoa will be responsibly sourced.
Other questions?
Hi, I'm Bob Axelrod with Fleischman Hillard, and I've got a question. For so many of us in this room that live and breathe sustainability every day, it's easy to lose sight that there's likely billions of people on this planet for whom this is not top of mind or even on their thought agenda. And I'd just love to hear your thoughts on, with so many iconic consumer brands, what could Mars do to turn this apathy or mild interest into action? And could you envision seeing a time when you collaborate with your competitors and with other great brands to drive action at the consumer level that has, we've talked about this throughout the conference, how important that is going to be, and it's just really just not happening. So I was just wondering what your thoughts might be on that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think that we definitely are a subscriber to the notion that there are certain things that are pre-competitive and are not things that we should be inherently, kind of competing in the marketplace on. I'll give you an example, one of them being food safety. We have a global food safety center that we've established in China, and that's very much in conjunction with the government. It's open, and it's an open resource that we actually also have been able to bring together resources from the WHO, from the FDA, and so forth, to actually bring them to a point of collaboration. And it's completely open to our competitors as well. It's a total open book, because a food safety issue doesn't benefit anybody, particularly consumers. So there are for sure areas where we see, it in our best interest to operate in a non-competitive way, in a pre-competitive way. Plastics would be another. In how we're actually trying to approach the plastics issue. I don't want to go too far afield, but suffice to say that we're not going to solve that ourselves. We need to actually go out and find our peers who have the same issues, using the same materials that we do, come together and actually try to build a consortium to signal that there's a demand to those who do make the packaging that we rely upon, to actually change what they're doing to enable us to achieve our goals. And from a branded standpoint, I think probably not, because brands are what ultimately companies really do compete on with regards to consumers. But I think that purpose is coming more and more to brands, including those at Mars. A conversation I've been having very recently, which perhaps is of value, is that success shouldn't perhaps inherently be a TV advertisement. For M&Ms and wind power, which all our M&Ms in North America are powered with wind at this point. But there are surely consumers out there who eat M&Ms and who care about sustainability that we can find now through digital means. And we can engage them, and we can empower them and have a conversation and a relationship with them to actually take that cohort and actually build from that. So that's a few thoughts on that.
We have time for another question. Sorry.
Hi, Harriet Howie, Diageo. It's wonderful to hear about your target for cutting your greenhouse gas emissions in your supply chain by 2/3. That's a very audacious goal, and often there's both a lack of roadmap of how to achieve this sort of target and an innovation gap in the technology currently available. I was wondering how you've approached that challenge at Mars, and whether you had any learnings that you'd like to share.
Right. Well, again, I mean, I guess I don't want to be too much just speaking in platitudes, but I think first and foremost is to try to understand where the issues lie, and so and to be very specific about it. So in terms of emissions that we're looking at in our supply chain, roughly about 50% come from deforestation and 50% come from farm emissions. And so clearly between the two, there's one big ticket item there, and that's deforestation. Again, it's not there's no easy solution to it, but now that we've identified it, we can actually go about the business of rolling up our sleeves and trying to figure out who are the partners that we can work with, and what resources we can bring to the table in terms of knowledge, money, new insights, new ways of thinking, etc. So I'm not sure that really helps you, but I mean that's I think that's how we're approaching it.
Good. Maybe one final question right there. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Vanessa Wright from Pernod Ricard. Like you, we have a lot of brands that come from nature, and I can see from how you've talked about things today that nature and natural ingredients are hugely important, and you place a lot of emphasis on that. I was just wondering if around all of that you have initiatives to address some of the most pressing biodiversity issues around where you're sourcing those natural ingredients from.
Yeah, I mean, for the first thing that we can do for biodiversity is to grow more on less land. I mean, fundamentally, agriculture's got to shrink its footprint. And so I think that, that's where some of the interventions that I spoke about earlier, come to bear, and some of our approaches and thinking around land usage and land ownership even, come to bear. And I was going to say something else, but it's just slipped my mind. But but essentially, biodiversity is one of the SDG goals that we take very seriously, and the other thing I was going to say, I think, is is to increase and to put a real emphasis on agronomic practices, and so when it comes to a tree crop, it would be trying to bring to bear, an agroforestry approach as opposed to a monocrop tree crop. And when it comes to soil crops, it's about how to increase soil fertility and the biodiversity on the farm through, regenerative practices and otherwise.
Thank you, Stephen. Our time is shortly up, but thank you so much. So I think, lots of lessons in your remarks. So this idea of the importance of data, of science, but also extraordinary vision. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.